Fire, ash, silence. On Palm Sunday 1825, a city of ghosts decided to die. Not by sword, not by starvation, but by their own hand. Picture this: 10,000 skeletons walking into the guns of 30,000 well-fed soldiers. They called it the Exodus. It wasn't a battle. It was a funeral procession that fought back. By the end of the story, you'll see how a single explosion in a mud-brick town didn't just kill the defenders. It woke up the entire world. Missolonghi fell so Greece could rise. But first they had to pay the ultimate price in blood. To understand how a graveyard became a symbol of freedom, we must first understand the terror that was strangling the Greek Revolution. By 1825, the dream of independence was dying. It wasn't dying a hero's death, it was rotting. Civil wars had drained the treasury. European powers looked on with indifference. The Ottoman Empire, tired of the rebellion, had played its trump card. The Sultan called upon his most powerful vassal, Muhammad Ali of Egypt, to finish what the Turks could not. Enter Ibrahim Pasha. If the Ottoman commanders were old-school medieval warlords, Ibrahim was the future. Cold, calculated, European. His army had been trained by French veterans of the Napoleonic Wars. They didn't charge in disorganized mobs screaming religious slogans. They marched in step. They wore uniforms. They used the bayonet with mathematical precision. This wasn't a horde. This was a machine. Ibrahim landed in the Peloponnese and simply erased opposition. He burned olive groves. He enslaved villages. He turned the Garden of Greece into a desert. His strategy was brutally simple. If you cannot catch the fish, drain the water. By late 1825, this unstoppable force turned its eyes north to the one city that had defied the Sultan for years, Missolonghi. On a map, Missolonghi makes no sense as a fortress. It isn't built on a crag like Corinth. It isn't surrounded by massive stone walls like Rhodes. It's a fishing town sitting flat on a muddy lagoon, barely rising above sea level. From a distance, it looks like a collection of shacks sinking into the swamp. The walls were nothing more than dried mud and earthen ramparts, barely high enough to stop a determined horse. The moat was a shallow ditch filled with stagnant water. A single heavy cavalry charge should have ridden over the earthworks. But the lagoon was the city's shield and its secret. The waters around Missolonghi are a treacherous maze of shallows, silt banks, and islets. Deep-draft Ottoman warships couldn't get close enough to bombard effectively. They would run aground miles out. Only small, flat-bottomed boats could navigate the labyrinth. This meant any assault had to be amphibious, slow, and exposed. Inside this mud fence stood the free besieged, a collection of locals, refugees, and the remnants of the Suliotes, the legendary mountain warriors of Epirus. These men were living anachronisms. While Ibrahim's army practiced formation drills, the Suliotes were cleaning their yataghans and singing songs about Alexander the Great. They wore the fustanella, the pleated kilt, and fought with a ferocity that bordered on madness. They had no artillery corps. They had no supply lines. They had no uniforms. What they had was a complete, terrifying lack of fear. When Ibrahim arrived, the arrival of the Egyptian fleet changed the physics of the war. 135 ships darkened the horizon. Transport vessels disgorged regiment after regiment of fresh, disciplined infantry, Arab lancers, French-trained artillerymen, Mamluk cavalry. The combined force facing the town swelled to over 30,000 men. Inside the walls, barely 4,000 exhausted fighters and 10,000 women, children, and elderly. The odds were 7-1. The outcome seemed mathematically inevitable. Ibrahim rode out to meet Rashid Pasha, the Ottoman commander who had been battering the walls for months. Ibrahim looked at the ragged siege lines, then looked at the pathetic mud fence. He laughed. He reportedly told Rashid he wouldn't need months. He would take the fence in 14 days. He was wrong. The siege began with engineering. Ibrahim's French advisors laid out a grid of trenches, approaching the walls with the slow, inexorable creep of a glacier, zigzag patterns to deflect return fire, parallel ditches, battery positions. The first bombardments were apocalyptic. Thousands of shells rained down on the thatched roofs. The city burned. But when the shelling stopped and the Egyptian infantry advanced, they found the Greeks waiting. Ibrahim sent his regulars forward in tight columns. They marched with perfect discipline, but the mud of the lagoon neutralized their speed. The uneven ground broke their formations. From behind the earthworks, Greek fire was withering. The Suliotes didn't fire in volleys. They fired at will, every shot aimed by a marksman who had learned to shoot hunting mountain goats. They targeted officers. They targeted standard-bearers. Then the Greeks did the unthinkable. They didn't just hold the line, they jumped over the wall. Yatagan drawn, pistol in one hand, dagger in the other. The defenders charged into the muddy no-man's land. The psychological impact was devastating. Ibrahim's soldiers were trained to fight other soldiers, not demons who sprinted through artillery fire to engage in hand-to-hand combat. The modern bayonet is a clumsy weapon in a mud pit. The short Greek swords were efficient butchers. In those early weeks, the lagoon turned red. Ibrahim's 14-day promise evaporated. He threw wave after wave at the walls. Every time the result was the same, the fence held. But Ibrahim was not a man to be baited by insults. He was a mathematician of death. He realized brute force was expensive. He was losing hundreds of elite soldiers for every dozen Greeks he killed. So he stopped. The guns fell silent. The charges ceased. Ibrahim looked at the lagoon, looked at the supply boats sneaking in from the Ionian Islands. Under cover of darkness, he realized his mistake. He had been trying to break the wall. He needed to break the stomach. No more charges. No more glory. The fleet moved to block the sea lanes. The strategy shifted from assault to suffocation. The war became a war for the water. Small Greek boats maneuvering through the silt channels brought ammunition from the Ionian Islands and food from the Peloponnese. They were the umbilical cord keeping the rebellion alive. To strangle the city, Ibrahim had to sever the cord. The geography was defined by a chain of tiny islets, Vassalati, Dolmas, Klasova. If Ibrahim took these, he controlled the flow of food. Vassalati fell. Dolmas fell. The defenders inside Missolonghi watched the smoke rise from the lagoon. But there was one islet left, the most important one, Klasova. It was defended by 130 men. Not soldiers, 130 ragged, starving, exhausted men led by Kitsos Tsavelas, a Suliote warlord who treated warfare like a personal vendetta. On March 25th, the anniversary of the revolution's outbreak, Ibrahim launched a combined assault. It was overkill. It was hubris. It was a massacre, but not the one he expected. The waters around Klasova are shallow, a treacherous mix of mud and silt. Ibrahim's boats ran aground hundreds of yards from the islet. His soldiers had to jump into the water carrying muskets, ammunition, and bayonets. The water was waist-deep. The mud sucked at their boots. They were slow, exposed, and helpless. From the ramparts, the 130 defenders didn't panic. They waited until they could see the whites of the Egyptians' eyes. Then they opened fire. It wasn't a battle, it was a turkey shoot. The Egyptians couldn't run. The water was too deep. They couldn't duck, there was no cover. They couldn't charge, the mud held them fast. They simply died. Wave after wave of attackers waded into the Red Lagoon. Bodies began to pile up, creating gruesome floating barricades. Ibrahim, watching from his flagship, flew into a rage. How could 130 men stop an army? Finally, in desperation, Ibrahim himself jumped into a boat to rally his men. He got close enough to feel the heat. A Greek bullet found his leg. By sunset, the toll was catastrophic. Over 2,500 Ottoman and Egyptian soldiers lay dead or wounded in the lagoon. The defenders of Klasova lost roughly 35 men. It was one of the most lopsided victories in military history. Inside Missolonghi, church bells rang. They sang songs of victory. For a brief moment, they believed they had won. But they were wrong. Ibrahim wasn't broken. He was just done playing games. The victory at Klasova paradoxically sealed Missolonghi's fate. It forced Ibrahim to fully commit to the blockade. He brought in smaller gunboats that could navigate the shallows. He linked them together with chains and floating booms. By the first week of April, the seal was airtight. Not a single boat could get in. Not a sack of flour, not a grain of wheat. Inside the walls, the heroics of Klasova faded into the grim reality of biology. The city had been under siege for a year. The stockpiles were long gone. The cats and dogs had disappeared months ago. Now the famine began in earnest. They started with the donkeys and horses. When the livestock was gone, the diet turned to the grotesque. They boiled leather shoes to soften the hide and drank the broth. They ate the oil-soaked rags used to clean rifles. They scavenged the lagoon for seaweed, boiling the salty kelp until it was gray slime. They hunted mice and rats with the same intensity they hunted Turks. Scurvy swept through the population like a plague. Gums bled, teeth fell out, old wounds reopened. Men who could sprint up a mountain in full armor a month ago now needed a walking stick to cross the town square. But here's where it gets insane: they didn't surrender. Ibrahim knew they were starving. He sent envoys to the walls offering mercy. "Surrender," the messengers shouted. "The Pasha admires your courage. He will let you live. He will let you leave. Just open the gates." Imagine the temptation: the smell of roasting meat wafting from the Ottoman lines, the cries of your own children begging for bread. All you have to do is open a wooden gate, and the pain stops. The answer from the walls was silence or a single gunshot. The defenders had entered a psychological state that transcended logic. They called it the brotherhood of hunger. Suffering became a badge of honor. To eat was to be weak. To starve was to be free. By mid-April, the situation was terminal. The leadership gathered for a final council. They looked at their men, ghosts with sunken eyes and paper-thin skin. They couldn't lift their heavy muskets anymore. They were leaning against the walls, waiting for the end. A decision had to be made. They could stay. If they stayed, they would die of starvation within a week. Too weak to fight, they would be slaughtered in their beds like sheep. Or they could surrender, open the gates and trust the word of a man who had burned half of Greece, live as slaves. Or they could do the impossible. Whispers began to circulate through the starving town. A plan so desperate, so suicidal that only men who had already accepted death could conceive it. They wouldn't wait for Ibrahim to come to them. They wouldn't wait to die in the mud. They would walk out. All of them. The men, the women, the children, the wounded. The entire population of Missolonghi would open the gates, march across the plain, and cut a road through 30,000 enemy soldiers to the mountains beyond. It was madness. It was suicide. It was the only choice left. That date was set for the night of April 10th, Palm Sunday. The irony was not lost on them. The day of Christ's entry into Jerusalem would be the day of their exit into eternity. Inside the walls, preparations began in silence. Women tore up their remaining clothes to make bandages. Men sharpened their yataghans for the last time. Those too sick or wounded to walk were moved to the stone houses near the powder magazines. They knew they couldn't make the journey. They were being prepared for a different role. Christos Capsulis, a venerable elder of the city, took command of the largest magazine. He gathered the sick, the women who refused to leave, and the old men. They sat on kegs of gunpowder. They began to sing funeral dirges while they were still alive. At 7 p.m., the Bishop Porphyrios Joseph performed the final rites. There was no bread for communion, so he blessed them with his tears. The gates were unbarred. The plan relied on surprise. They needed to cross the open plain, reach the enemy trenches, and break through before the Ottoman machine could wake up. But the universe has a cruel sense of humor. A deserter, a Bulgarian mercenary who had been fighting for the Greeks, slipped out of the city hours before. He went straight to Ibrahim's tent. He told him everything. Ibrahim didn't panic. He smiled. He simply moved his pieces on the chessboard. He reinforced the exact sector where the Greeks planned to strike. He positioned his artillery to create a kill zone. He placed his cavalry on the flanks, hidden in darkness, waiting for the signal. The trap was set. At 8 p.m., the first column moved out. They moved like ghosts, their feet wrapped in rags to stifle the sound. They crossed the moat. They crossed the open ground. They reached the first line of Ottoman trenches. Silence. The Greek vanguard thought they had succeeded. They crept forward, yataghans drawn, ready to slit the throats of sleeping sentries. Then a single musket shot rang out. It was signal. Suddenly the night evaporated. Flares and torches were lit along the entire Ottoman line. The darkness was replaced by a blinding, flickering light. From the darkness came the thunder. Ibrahim's artillery, pre-sighted on the bridges and the open plain, opened fire simultaneously. Canister shot, cans filled with musket balls that turn a cannon into a giant shotgun, tore through the Greek columns. But the Greeks did not stop. They roared, "Eleftheria! Freedom!" and charged. The first column hit the Ottoman lines with the force of a tsunami. These were men who had been starving for months, men who had nothing left to lose. They leaped into the trenches. The fighting was primal. No tactics, no formations, just knives, teeth, and rocks. They clawed their way through the first line, then the second. For a moment it looked like the impossible might happen. Then catastrophe struck. In the chaos, the third column, the one carrying the women and children, a shout went up, "O Piso! O Piso! Back! Back!" Historians still debate who yelled it. Some say it was a traitor. Others say it was panic-induced hallucination. But the effect was devastating. The civilians, terrified by the artillery and the sudden wall of fire, heard the command to retreat. They panicked. The column broke. Thousands of women and children turned around and ran back toward the city gates. The cohesion of the exodus shattered. The spearhead was cut off from the body. And that's when the cavalry charged. Ibrahim unleashed his Mamluks and Albanian horsemen. They didn't charge the soldiers, they charged the civilians. The plain between the city and the trenches became a slaughterhouse. Horses trampled women into the mud. Sabers swung in the torchlight. The wails of children rose above the roar of the cannons. It was no longer a battle, it was a hunt. Those who made it back to the city found no safety. The Ottoman infantry, sensing the rout, scrambled over the walls. The mud fence that had held for a year was finally breached. Inside the city, every house became a fortress. Wounded men fired from windows until they were killed. Women threw rocks from rooftops. But the end was inevitable. The flood of Ottoman soldiers was unstoppable. They pushed the defenders back street by street toward the center, toward the stone houses where the immovable were waiting. Christos Kapsalis sat in the dark of the magazine. He could hear the screams getting closer. He could smell the smoke of the burning city. He checked the fuse of his torch. He looked at the faces around him. The sick, the elderly, the young mothers holding babies. They were terrified, yes, but they were also ready. The door burst open. Ottoman soldiers poured in, shouting in triumph, expecting plunder and slaves. Kapsalis didn't hesitate. He didn't give a speech. He simply lowered the torch. The explosion was tectonic. It wasn't just a boom, it was an erasure. The entire neighborhood disintegrated. The blast waved through bodies, Greek and Turk alike, hundreds of yards into the lagoon. Kapsalis took hundreds of the enemy with him. It wasn't the only one. Across the city, as the Ottomans breached other strongpoints, the same scene played out. The bishop, barricaded in the windmill with his flock, held out until the ammunition was gone. When the enemy broke down the doors, he set fire to the powder kegs. Boom! Another house. Boom! The city of Missolonghi committed suicide rather than surrender. The night was lit by the flashes of these massive suicides. It was a symphony of self-destruction. By dawn, the city was gone. In its place was a smoking ruin filled with corpses. Of the 3,000 soldiers who attempted the breakout, only 1,300 made it to the safety of the mountains. They were wraiths, bleeding, starving, leaving a trail of dead behind them. Of the 10,000 civilians, almost none survived. Most were killed on the plain or in the city. The survivors, mostly young women and children, were captured, bound in chains, and prepared for the slave markets of Alexandria and Constantinople. But the victory tasted like ash in Ibrahim's mouth. He walked through the smoldering ruins the next morning. He saw the piles of his own dead mixed with the Greeks. He saw the shattered remains of the powder magazines. He realized that while he had taken the geography, he had failed to take the spirit. From a military standpoint, it was a total defeat. The rebellion in western Greece was crushed. The path to Athens was open. The revolution seemed to be over. But in the strange alchemy of history, the blood spilled that night was more powerful than any victory. The sound of Kapsalis's explosion didn't stop at the lagoon. It echoed across the sea. It reached the coffee houses of Paris. It reached the parliament in London. It reached the palaces of St. Petersburg. The world had watched the Greeks fight for 5 years with a mix of admiration and skepticism. But Missolonghi changed the narrative. This wasn't just a war anymore. It was a martyrdom. The image of the starving mother charging a cannon. The image of the old man blowing himself up. These weren't just war stories, they were religious iconography for a secular age. Europe woke up. The artists, the poets, the politicians, they could no longer look away. The news of the fall hit Europe like a physical blow. For years, the Greek cause had been popular among intellectuals, but governments had remained cold. They viewed the Greeks as rebels disturbing the balance of power. But Missolonghi changed the moral calculus. The stories of the starvation, the exodus, and the self-immolation of capsulists spread like wildfire. They were printed in newspapers in London, Paris, and Berlin. Victor Hugo wrote poems. Eugene Delacroix painted Greece on the ruins of Missolonghi, depicting a woman symbolizing Greece standing with open arms over a pile of rubble. It became the Guernica of the 19th century. The public outcry was deafening. Philhellenism, the love of Greek culture, transformed from a hobby for rich poets into a mass political movement. People in France and Britain demanded to know why their governments were letting Christian heroes